Well, welcome everyone. My name is Nathan Alexander. I'm the project manager with the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. Welcome to this panel discussion on the question of whether there has been a religious revival. And this webinar, it's co-presented by the NCF project at the University of Ottawa and also by the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at the University of Victoria. So I'll do a land acknowledgement first, and then I'll introduce the speakers and moderator. The Non-Religion in a Complex Future project is based at the University of Ottawa in Ottawa, Canada. Please join us as we pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So let me introduce the panelists, and then we'll get into the discussion. Conrad Hackett is Associate Director of Research and Senior Demographer at Pew Research Center. Kati Tervo-Niemelä is Professor in Practical Theology at the University of Eastern Finland. Joel Thiessen is Professor of Sociology at Ambrose University. Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Waterloo. And David Voas is Emeritus Professor of Social Science at University College London. And the moderator is Laurie Beeman, who is professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa and the director of the NCF project. So Laurie, take it away.
Thanks, Nathan, very much. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. We were very excited when we saw that there was a fairly large crowd who had signed up, and I think this is probably something that we've all been seeing in the news. Can't look at the news coverage every day without seeing a story. And there's been this sort of reports of a religious revival in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the National Post in Canada, Wall Street Journal, The Conversation. And just before we did this, I asked a master's student I'm working with, Claire Offenberger, to just go through and see if she could find the stories. It was unbelievable how many stories there have been. Like many of you, over the last few months, I have been contacted by numerous media outlets, always wanting to talk about the religious revival. And as Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme started, as we were just, sort of chatting beforehand, it's not only is there a religious revival anymore, it's the story is there is a religious revival. And what does that look like? I've had the pleasure of speaking with some of the panelists one-on-one about this. I think the first conversation I had about it was with David Vos. And I just said I knew he had been writing about it. And I said, wow, David, thanks for writing this. It's really interesting to see how this story has such legs and continues to. It's continuing to make the news, which is amazing. So the way we're going to start is we'll go around to the panelists first, and I'll just get them to give their reflections. As we've entitled this "Wishful Thinking: Is there a religious revival?" And thought we would just get our panelists to weigh in for a couple of minutes. It is intended to be conversational, not a formal presentation. And so I'll start with David. David, wishful thinking: Is there a religious revival?
I don't think that we have any good evidence so far. I think there's a little bit of evidence that something might be happening, but I'll get on to that. To me, it's reminiscent of the supposed revival among young Muslims in Europe a decade and a half ago. So many young women started to wear the hijab as an expression of religious identity. And a good number of qualitative researchers concluded that we were seeing something like resurgent religiosity in the younger generation. And in fact, what became clear when I did a comprehensive investigation with Fenella Fleischman for the annual review of sociology was that no one was paying attention to the many young Muslim heritage people who had gone in the other direction. So overall, there was no net change in religiosity over time or across generations. But there did appear to be more dispersion among the children of immigrants. So that's to say that compared to their parents, you could find more people at both the religious and the secular ends of the scale. And I think it's at least arguable that we might be seeing that kind of thing, though I wouldn't want it to be exaggerated. So, for example, the Bible Society in the UK, which bears weighty responsibility for generating this narrative, um, suggested in its very latest report that in the Church of England, teenage and adult baptisms have increased by more than 1,000 in 2024 compared to 2023. And that's in a section headed, "There's a rise in Christian conversions." Well, that's correct, but look at the context. The Church of England reported a few months ago that practically all of its numbers now are well down on 2019 levels. Attendance measured a dozen different ways, baptisms, confirmations, weddings, funerals, you name it. The one exception has been adult baptisms. So infant and child, that is, say, under 5, baptisms fell by nearly 8,000 between 2023 and 2024, and by nearly 30,000 since 2019, just before the pandemic. So the number of infant baptisms now is barely half what it was in 2019. That means that tens of thousands of young adults, and remember, a lot of the focus has been on young adults, so tens of thousands of young adults who might less than a decade ago have christened their children are now choosing not to do so. So it's certainly interesting that adult baptisms have had a small boost, but is it really evidence for a religious revival, all things considered? I think that the story is really quiet quitting, and quiet quitting continues to outbalance any sort of quiet revival.
Thanks, David. Conrad, I'll go to you next. So, wishful thinking? Is there a religious revival?
Probably not. But the first point I want to make is that as social scientists, I'm not aware that we really have a technical definition of when a revival is in place. For so many decades, we've been tracking various kinds of religious decline around the world that we haven't really had much opportunity in the contemporary world to measure what could be classified as revival. Sure, in some places, there may be some exceptions to that, Eastern Europe perhaps. But I think two things that are happening that's interesting is we always have churches that are growing. It's always in any year, you can go to a particular place, find a campus ministry or a church that is bigger now than it used to be. And separately, I also think we're seeing a lot of social engagement that's people who during the pandemic were isolated and they're seeking out all kinds of different communities. That's happening to some degree. But does all of this add up to national level increases in the share of people identifying with a religion or going to a religious worship service? In all the cases I've looked into, the answer is no. In some cases, we have a plateau. We don't have national level increase, certainly not in the UK, not in the US, not in many other places where I've read reports about this kind of thing happening. And a big culprit is the Quiet Revival report that came out. What was really striking about that is it had two data points. It said there's been a huge increase from time one in 2018 to time two in 2024. It wasn't the first problematic poll in the UK to suggest really high levels of worship attendance among young adults, but it was framed in such a way that it said, like, there's the tide has turned. God is doing an incredible thing. And it just started this domino effect where all of a sudden after that, people started looking around and noticing growing congregations and interesting things happening in a lot of places. And we began to see people saying that thing that happened in the UK, it's happening here too in Canada. It's happening in the US. And they're citing reports from one another to reinforce the narrative.
Thank you, Conrad. Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button. Kati, wishful thinking?
Well, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. I think the answer is rather complex. And the context where I'm from Finland, and I have been doing research on religious change and young people for 25 years. And for 20 years, it was clearly research on decline, on on increasing distancing, increasing leaving the church issues. It was so strongly that kind of research that I had the bishops of the church, the Lutheran Church of Finland, several times calling me saying, Kati, please do not do research on this. You are causing this phenomenon. Because, of course, the media was also attracted on that leaving issue and the increasing distancing. But actually, we do see something strange taking place in Finland, and we don't any longer see the same decline as we used to see. If it's okay to share a few slides, I could do that now or later. How do you see, Lori?
Yeah, just remember there are others to speak, but you're good at getting through materials quickly, Kati. So yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Nathan,
I will just quickly show a little bit of the basic situation in our context. If I think of Finland, it's the majority church is the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which has been declining, and it's typical, very typical that church attendance is low. But at the same time, young people are very actively taking part of church confirmation. It's still 72% who are confirmed, and this is the basic situation. But if we have collected various data sets over the years, and this is from Kimmo Ketola, my dear colleague. And if we look at these longitudinal data sets, we generally see that each generation is less religious than the previous one. Here is the share of those who regard themselves as Christian. But if we look at the very youngest generation here, it's no longer so that they are the share of those who regard themselves as Christian is lower, but it is higher than among the previous generation. And this was something unexpected. And something happened around 2020, around that year. And if we look at men and women separately, we see the decline over the generations, over the years, very clearly among young men and women. But when it comes to for the very latest generation, those who are born after 1996, those don't follow the same pattern among men. And also among women, there is something not so clear. But it is especially among men that we see something unexpected. And we have also collected plenty of data from the confirmants, from the Lutheran confirmants. And we have longitudinal data among them. We have data from 2001 till last year. And for example, when we have asked them if they believe that Jesus has risen from the dead, we saw for a long time, both among boys and girls, that the share of those who believe has been clearly declining. But over the last years, we have actually seen a development that we didn't expect, and especially among young men, that there is increase in the number of those who believe. And these data sets are very large. We have about 1/3 of all youth in Finland who have answered these surveys during the previous years. But anyhow, there is something going on in Finland, and we have tried to find answers to what is going on, and we have also done interviews, and we have just recently also published an article in the Journal for the Scientific Study based on our interviews among young men. Why are they attracted to Christianity? So my answer is there is actually something going on. Yes.
There is something going on. There's always something going on in Finland, Kati. There's always something going on in Finland. Thank you for that. I think that is maybe perhaps an interesting blip or an interesting difference. Joel, wishful thinking, or is there, what's going on, Joel?
Well, when I first saw the reports, I think like Conrad noted, I was very leery because of sort of a single study in a short period of time. It certainly raised questions for me on the need for longitudinal data. What do we see over a longer period of time? And I think this is one of the questions for us as social scientists is, how do we define and measure revival? What is the period of time that we look across to sort of assess those kinds of things? What are the different markers? Belief, behavior, identity, salience. We're looking at both individual and institutional markers, etc. So those are all the questions that started to emerge for me as I saw some of these reports. So I don't see clear evidence of a revival over a longer period of time. I do think it's wishful thinking. I think in part this comes from religious groups themselves and special interest groups who are leading different religious initiatives, or sorry, research initiatives. And I don't think there's anything untoward in sort of the underlying aims and so forth here. But I think there is a bit of a conflation of special interest groups that are wishing some of these narratives on short periods of time. And I think this is where our social scientific training can give us cause for pause, that maybe there are some potential indicators of things that are worth paying attention to. And I think it's something quite different to note that versus universally saying we have this massive revival, the things have shifted, and then to see all the narratives that emerge out of that. So a lot of my interactions with church leaders, I constantly hear this revival narrative, and I see that sort of anecdotally at local congregational levels. And they're extrapolating these large-scale social shifts based on perhaps local experiences. And so I think perhaps something is happening in individual smaller contexts and congregations, and I think these are really interesting social scientific questions that we ought to explore. I don't actually think we have paid as much attention to conversion / revival, etc. And I think there's opportunities there. But I think the grand narrative is certainly one of wishful thinking that we see both among church leaders and in the media, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that later on.
Thanks, Joel. Sarah, last but not least, is
Well,
there a revival?
Well, so I define religious revival as a meaningful, sustained increase in levels of religiosity among a population that had lower levels of religiosity in the past. So that's kind of how I go for revivals. I'm not seeing any evidence of that in Canada. StatsCan just released their 2023 General Social Survey data last month, and all religiosity indicators amongst 15 to 24-year-olds are down a bit from pre-pandemic levels from 2018. And so in terms of practice and identity, there doesn't seem to be any increase population-wide amongst that age group. There's a few things that I'm cautious and critical about in the existing reports that claim a revival in Canada. A lot of their surveys that they're using have very small samples of young adults, only 100 or 200, which means big margins of error, which is problematic for me. It's also, when you're surveying young adults, we have to be extra careful now because a lot of young adults don't answer surveys, and so it's harder to get a representative sample of them. So that's just my survey methodologist speak. So that's one thing to keep in mind. There is some anecdotal evidence of youth vitality in some congregations in Canada that's come up. It could be due to what Joel refers to as kind of pockets of vitality that can also coexist with larger decline. There's also the immigration factor. So in Canada, we've had 2 big years of immigration in 2023 and 2024, lots of newcomers to the country. And I'm guessing that the Catholic groups who are seeing seeing more young people in their parishes now, especially in urban areas, are probably seeing it more from that immigration effect than they are from conversion, even though they themselves interpret it as a conversion. And so, there can be vitality. It doesn't necessarily have to come from conversion either. I think one other thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, at least here in Canada, well, across the Western world as well, we've seen most of the silent generation now, so that's the kind of boomers' parents, have mostly passed away. And they were a very religious generation, right? They were quite actively religious, especially here in Canada. And so now when you look at like a population spread of religious practices, we've lost that more actively religious older age group for the most part, and boomers are really not religious here in Canada in many ways, are not practicing, are not attending religious services with any regularity for the most part. And so now that so it shifts a bit, and it looks, the spread looks a bit different. I think it's less to do with younger generations being more religious and more to do with older generations now being less religious than they were in the past.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks everyone for that first round of response. And I should have said at the outset that we will open for questions eventually, but we want to just explore a little bit further with our panelists, who have all been doing some serious thinking about this issue. And I wanted to ask them, why, in the face of what seems to be evidence to the contrary, with the possible exception of Finland. And I will eventually also ask the panelists if they have questions for each other before we turn to general questions. But why then is the revival, and thank you, Sarah, for defining revival for us. Why is the revival story so persistent? It has been unbelievable, actually. Why is it so persistent? Sarah, do you want to start? Just go back around.
Okay, we'll do a reverse grid. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so part of me kind of believes and that religious leaders saying there's a religious revival is something that's as old as time. I'm sure at some point in pre-Roman era in Britain, a druid was like, yeah, I had like tons of people in my field taking part in the rituals. And then someone else was like, there was like 5 people in that field. So, I mean, throughout Canadian history, you see this, even the Methodist revivals of the 19th and 20th century. A lot of historians now sort of point out that maybe it was the numbers were a bit overblown by faith leaders. So, I mean, that narrative has always, not always, but is often present. I'm thinking of the millennial generation. The narrative was very similar when they came onto the scene when they were young adults. Like, oh, they're the most open generation to spirituality and religion. And then in Canada and many other Western countries, they went on to be the least religious generation we've ever seen. And so, I mean, there's that kind of ongoing cyclical event, in my view, that we get with each generation in some ways. But the media attention, I mean, it's clickbait in some ways. It's different from the status quo, so it's a story, right? That's the impression I got from a lot of journalists. And also, I feel, people can debate this. In Canada, there's been less money pumped into good quality journalism in the last few decades. Most of the mainstream media outlets have had to shrink or kind of reduce their journalism. And I'm not sure how much time journalists now have to really research things properly in some cases. And so I saw some of that in the journalists who contacted me, was that they'd heard anecdotal evidence from one person and they assumed that was what it was happening for the whole population, which I had to explain to them is not necessarily the case. So, I mean, there's a few things going on, but yeah, I think it's a new story. It's different from the status quo, and people like that, right? In this day and age, they pick up on that, and that's the story that journalists are typically looking for.
Thanks, Sarah. I would add that it's not only religious leaders, sometimes it's also social scientists who add to this,
absolutely.
With a kind of, if I may say, will to religion. So, Joel, why is this story persisting?
Yeah, I think, I mean, certainly in the media, initially, kind of a new, exciting story, different from the narrative we've had so far. I think there's been a bit of a contagion effect that's kind of ballooned in all kinds of directions there. I know that several individuals that have interviewed me for different media things, this is deeply personal for them. And it almost seems like they've willed their own personal narrative into a centerpiece of these stories as they've tried to process and make sense of their own kind of religious, if you want to call it conversion or exiting or anywhere along that continuum. So I think there's some of that in play. I think among religious leaders, I think there's an element of confirmation bias. Right? They might be a part of a local church where they've seen some young people who have joined, maybe converted, and they start seeing these stories emerging in the news, and then they just sort of start seeing everything through that particular lens, and it gains momentum in all kinds of ways and directions. So, and I think I mean, when we talk about wishful thinking, I think that's probably the strongest case, more so among religious groups than it is among media per se, and maybe among some segments of sort of social scientists who are actively religious as well, who want to see a bit of a different narrative. And we see this going back to like secularization theory in the 80s and 90s and sort of discussions toward this end as well. So yeah, I think a bit of a contagion effect, a bit of confirmation bias among different groups there.
We'll go over to Conrad. Conrad, why have these stories persisted?
We have a problem with surveys. And the problem is that the general public, religious leaders, journalists, and even many social scientists don't know how to distinguish between one survey and another. And there's a tendency to say, if a survey said this is true, it must be true. Fortune magazine published a story about a year ago that said 79% of Gen Z adults are bringing their parent with them to a job interview. Okay, now just think about that for a minute. Does it really seem plausible that 8 out of 10 young adults are bringing their parent to a job interview? I think we all have enough experience. We can say that's ridiculous. And I don't know why Fortune published that. It's kind of a neat story, if it were true, of course, but it was an opt-in online poll. It's not credible. And a lot of the same kind of thing is happening in religion journalism, where there are problematic surveys producing interesting results. And especially if you have an editor or a journalist who isn't going to double check that against more solid evidence and say, maybe we shouldn't run that story. The stories get run, people read them, they believe them. If they even look up the study and try to figure out how was this sample collected, a lot of times the surveys don't have very much information. They make bold claims about the surveys being nationally representative because they took people who volunteered to take surveys and got rewards for them. And then they weight that to some census targets and say, okay, now we have a nationally representative survey. And we know that this kind of online opt-in survey work has a huge problem when it comes to rare behaviors. And in many countries, church going is a rare behavior, and it has big problems for young adults. And so the problem gets magnified when you're talking about what is a rare behavior for young adults. And all of a sudden we get these really sensational stories about huge shares of young adults going to church often and more often than their elders, when what we see consistently across surveys, even in the survey data that Kati shared from Finland, is in general, what I saw in that slide is it's still the case that older Finns are in general more religious than younger Finns. And certainly that's the pattern we see in the UK and in the US consistently, and I think probably in Canada too. So there's a lot of things going on, but we have a crisis in surveys and a problem in helping people distinguish between higher quality and lower quality surveys.
Thanks, Conrad. So in some measure, then, it's a problem of survey and scientific literacy, and its sort of basic ability to bring a critical thinking skill set to survey information and to stories we see anyhow. Thanks. Kati, we'll try you again.
Well, let's make a new try. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Well, I would like to add to what Conrad said about the crisis of surveys, that if we think of young people at the moment, those are also young people who have been raised in a world where crises in general have been very close to their life through social media and through internet. All the crises in the world come very close to them. So I think it is possible that their world in general is so much different than was the life among the older generations. So I would not be surprised if, when it comes to religion, that something unexpected would happen among them. And also if we think of the role of social media in their lives, that's also something that is very unexpected, that they are under new influence, under such influences that young people have not previously been. So if I think of young people in Finland and if I think of the pandemic, if I think of the war in Ukraine and all of the sort of the basic security situation they have been raised in, that is totally different than the previous generation. So I would not be surprised if they also find something interesting and some new interest in Christianity as well. So I would not just directly say that this phenomenon is not there, but there is also possibility that the world for the young people is so much different than it was for the previous generation, that they search for stability, they search for security, for example, from Christianity. As, for example, our interviews show also strongly that they search for stability. And Christianity is one of those places where they find stability in the world, where everything else seems to be changing constantly.
Thank you, Kati. David, why are these stories persisting?
All of the panelists have made good suggestions. Just to follow up immediately on what Kati was saying, I think there is constantly this notion that we're living in peculiar times. I don't think we're living in especially peculiar times, except to the degree that the times are always, to some extent, peculiar. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the polarization in the United States that attended the Vietnam War. I'm old enough to remember the 3-day work week in Great Britain. The crises of the past were at least as bad as the crises of the present. So I'm not persuaded by the idea that we live in times that are driving people to religion. I think that this is a classic man bites dog story. It's a good news story for people whose whole business is proclaiming the good news, and that's understandable. I think it's also a kind of non-science science story. So if we think about the Bible Society's Quiet Revival report, it was not the kind of thing that would ever have been published in an academic journal because there was no reference to any contrary evidence. As I think Conrad noted, it was looking at two data points, one before, one after the pandemic. The underlying data weren't released. There was really nothing there that would give you the kind of confidence that we would expect to have in a peer-reviewed scientific publication. Of course, it wasn't peer-reviewed. And the hyperbole in the report reminds us of a certain American president. The last page in the new Bible Society report, this is the one that's Quiet Revival 1 year on, or quotes the last concluding page, there is a movement of God unlike what any of us have seen in our lifetimes. I mean, doesn't that sort of uh, make you think about the greatest deal that there will ever be in the greatest country that there will ever be? To me, these are people who want the prestige and the respect and the credibility of science without actually doing science.
Thank you, David. Clearly, the weight of the world I was feeling all winter could have been somewhat lifted had I talked to you to put what's happening in perspective. So, thank you for that. I'm wondering if we could just give the panelists a few minutes with each other to have some cross conversation until we open the floor to questions more broadly. So, do you have questions or comments to each other? David did just respond to Kati, and I'm just wondering if any of you would like to sort of ask each other a question or make a comment. Conrad, please.
Sure. So we've been talking a lot about the YouGov surveys that were done for the Bible Society and the ensuing Quiet Revival reports. We hear that YouGov is going to do another survey. So it's another online opt-in survey. And they promise this time they're going to do it better than before, not make all the mistakes they've admitted to making. And so I'm curious, David, how do you expect to interpret the results of that next report, whatever it may show? What value, if any, might it have?
I don't know what value is going to have. I mean, the key problem, of course, is that in looking at religious change, we really want a whole set of recurrent cross-sectional studies, ideally following the same sort of methods and mode over time so that the studies are comparable. YouGov may come along and say, okay, here's another point estimate, and that's always interesting. Indeed, I wouldn't have had any problem if initially the report from the Bible Society had just said, here's an interesting survey, make of it what you will. But I think the problem is that we can't really make very much of it in isolation. Could I just make a point, Laurie, if you'll allow me? This phenomenon of the very youngest adult generation, what you might call emerging adults, people who are, say, 18 up to early 20s, being on the face of it more religious than people in their later 20s is a very, very common phenomenon. Indeed, if you go to the seculartransition.org website that I manage, you will find a document in there which shows the dozens and dozens of international surveys where countries from around the world have produced exactly that sort of finding. And as I think Sarah mentioned, what typically happens is over time, those people set up independent lives. They're no longer as influenced by their families of origin, and they turn out to be less religious than the generation before. But I do think that this may be part of the explanation for why this narrative about a revival got a certain amount of traction, because people did observe these emerging adults appearing to be more religious than the millennials, let's say. I think that that's an ephemeral matter, but of course, time will tell.
Thank you, David. Peter, I see your hand. We're not opening for questions yet, but you're first in line now. Sarah, do you want to respond to David? I know you've made comments on this before because I've heard you speak about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with David. It's the same in Canada and many other countries. Gen X, millennials, all whenever they appear on the survey scene for the first time. So we usually only start surveying them when they're adults, right? So 18 or older, usually. All their indicators were slightly higher because they were still being influenced by their parents and grandparents. They were going to religious services with them. They were still living with them for the most part, their parents. And it's interesting now because young adults live with their parents longer than in previous generations, right? Affordability crisis, or just kind of that kind of transition period to full adulthood where you have your own household, your own career takes longer now. It usually happens in people's 30s rather than necessarily in their 20s. And so, yeah, so we always see that there's like higher levels of religiosity. They look, young adults, when they're still living with their parents, look more like their parents than they do the kind of middle-aged adults. And then when they leave their parental home, not all, but a big chunk have typically disaffiliated amongst Gen X, amongst boomers, amongst millennials. And so far with Gen Z, we'll have to wait and see because most of them haven't left their parents' households yet. And so we'll just keep an eye on it. And it is possible, I don't want to believe that the trend will go on forever. Maybe something will change, and that's why we keep an eye on these numbers. But so far, Gen Z looks a lot like these previous generations did at this age.
Thanks, Sarah. Kati, I wondered if you wanted an opportunity to respond to any of this, because certainly what you're saying about the Finnish data seems to suggest that there's something else happening there. So, did you want to respond?
Well, I could perhaps add also that what we see in Finland is the increased openness on speaking about religion among young generation. When we ask the various generations, do you speak openly about religion in your family or with your friends? The young people are much more likely to say, yes, we do speak openly. And that may also have an influence on this issue as well, that young people in general, they are more open on issues related to religion and also other deep issues as well. And especially strongly we see that change among young men, that they are more open on talking about various deep issues. It's very typical to say that Finnish men do not speak nor kiss, but it seems that the young generation, at least to some extent, speaks. And that is one change also that has been taking place at the same time, which may have an influence on this issue as well in our context.
Thanks. Any responses? Joel, do you have anything to add or questions you'd like to ask of your fellow panelists?
Yeah, I think I'm struck in the conversation on the scientific literacy or lack thereof, a kind of larger piece. And I think there's a great role and opportunity for those of us in this conversation of how do we help sort of the wider public to become more literate in these kinds of things on how to read and understand data and what data do and do not mean. And everything from sampling to methods to how we interpret data and so forth. So I think that stands out to me. I think about, again, many of the journalists that I've spoken to, it's interesting some of the refrains that they bring into the interviews of, I spoke to a local church leader, they'll say, and they've offered these 5 explanations for why the revival is happening based on their local, I wouldn't even say experience, it's kind of their projected accounts or explanations that are not really substantiated. And so all of those kinds of things even tell us something about how some journalists in these spaces are thinking about, or perhaps not, on sort of the scientific role or nature of how they're informing some of their reports and studies. And so I think all those kinds of things are standing out to me, and just a great opportunity that we have, especially in sociology of religion, where there hasn't, at least in Canada, always been a lot of media attention. I know Reg Bibi always said that sort of the worst thing is for people to pay no attention to you. So whether it's good or bad, at least they're paying attention. And so I think we're at least getting some attention. And so how do we use those airwaves with the media to help with that scientific literacy piece? So yeah, I was thinking about that as different colleagues here were reflecting on this.
Thanks, Joel. Any other questions or comments for each other before we turn to the audience for questions and comments?
Laurie, maybe just one quick comment. This is about why the revival narrative has attained such traction. I really don't know the answer, but it is very striking to me that just last year, one of the very best known sociologists of religion, Christian Smith, published a book called Why Religion Went Obsolete. Now, I know the people in this room who don't particularly like the book, and that's fine. There are things that you can criticize. But this is somebody who has been critical throughout his career of the secularization thesis, who now is not only saying that religion is obsolescent, but that basically it can't come back. He's not saying religion is going through a bad patch. He is saying it is basically dead. And of course, he's talking about traditional religion. He thinks that there's still some kind of spirituality that can be cultivated, but that's another issue. But what's extraordinary to me is that this very well-known academic who engages with the public has received relatively little attention, I think, for this book, making pretty bold claims. And yet this very unscientific report, based on a couple of surveys, has gone round the world in stating that actually there's a revival. And they're talking essentially about the same generation. I mean, arguably, Christian Smith is talking about millennials, and the Quiet Revival Bible Society people are talking about Gen Z. But basically, it's young adults that are in question. And yet we have these completely different stories, and one narrative is getting a lot more attention than the other. And that's fascinating.
Thanks, David. Shall we go to the audience and receive some questions? Okay, thanks everyone for that round. Peter, you've had your hand up.
Yes, I did have my hand up. Thank you. I note that among the panelists, the only one willing to go in a different direction is Kati. And it's on the basis of, I know the research she's been conducting for quite some time, that the results of which I've heard several times already. I'm intrigued by this different direction. One of the things that it raises me is that, that national differences must be taken seriously. But the other one that I found particularly fascinating is the last comment that Kati made about openness to talking about it. And it reminds me a bit about, incidence of diseases increasing because they're being reported more often, right? As opposed to happening more often. But in that regard, what I wanted to ask Kati is in the measures that she has been using to look at this youngest generation, is this youngest generation also expressing its turnaround, whatever you want to call it, its increase in actual religious practice? One of the other kind of standard measures that we use for assessing people's religiosity. The things that you did mention confirmation, well, kind of cultural um, uh, belief statements and identification. They are, I mean, they might well be important, but it seems to me that there's a measure lacking, and I'm wondering what the results is on that side.
Thank you, Peter. Can I just go on, Flori? Yeah. Well, first we actually thought that this change is only ideological, and it didn't show in any ways, for example, in their when we asked them if they are willing to belong to the church, or if they want to pray, or if they want to attend somewhere. That didn't show any change. But the last two data sets that we have collected in 2024 and 2025, they actually show also increase in those measures, that those young people are also saying that they are more willing to be members of the church, and also more willing to pray, and they also are more willing to attend various church activities. And also there is actually an actual increase in the number of young volunteering in the church among young people. So there are some actual change also taking place among young people that is visible in the churches. But primarily, I would say that this change is an ideological change, that it's more about your beliefs and how you feel. Do you feel distant to the church or closer to the church, if it's something positive or negative? And what these young people also say, that in this current culture, non-religiousness has become the default factor. That is something that you are expected to be. You are expected to be non-religious. And that also makes Christianity more attractive, because it's no longer something that is expected from you and the sort of the default factor, but it is somehow a minority thing that you can sort of differentiate you from the others, and it can also be countercultural. And that is also what our young people also talk about, how Christianity is countercultural in our society, and that makes it attractive as well.
Thanks, Kati. So if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand on Zoom, or if you want to write the question in the chat too, I can read it. So we've got a question from the University of Victoria who's watching us. Yeah, do you want to unmute yourselves?
It's right there. Right there. Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, we can.
So we got a room full of people here. I am Matt Sheedy. I'm a fellow here at the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. If I can be so bold, there's another gentleman who has a question here after me. We could perhaps wait or ask them both at once, but I'll start with mine in any case. So I wanted to pick up on a thread that both Kati in particular was pulling on, and also something that David was saying. Thinking about the role of social media, I couldn't help but recall a concept perhaps coined by Tara Isabel Burton in her book Strange Rights. She talks about how with the rise of social media, we're seeing an increasing proliferation of what she calls remixed cultures, right? Where people are able to mix and match a whole hodgepodge of ideas, perhaps in ways that they weren't able to before. And of course, there's an argument to be made that this has been hyper accelerated with the growth of AI. So with that in mind, I'm wondering what this panel thinks about the ways in which religion is being categorized in light of new categories like remix culture. Here we might also think about the German term Querdenken, which in English often gets translated as diagonalism. And related to that, and David can certainly speak to the concept of conspirituality. If these aren't, associated with typical organized religion, right? Doesn't necessarily check a census box. Nonetheless, there seems to be some evidence, or at the very least, some chatter about these unorthodox or heterodox realignments that people are categorizing in a variety of ways. So I'm just wondering how those categories, accelerated by social media and perhaps now by AI, are factoring in to your research and thinking on these topics.
I don't know which panelist wants to take that one.
we need a cultural sociologist. I'm afraid that we're all very hardcore empirical people. Um,
I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to object to the contrast between a cultural sociologist and somebody who does empirical work. And also, there are several people on this Zoom who do cultural sociology.
Great. Well, I would encourage you to answer the question then.
Which question was that?
I guess how all of the uh, technological changes might be feeding into the sorts of narratives that are being promoted, if I understood correctly.
I mean, I think there's no question that, I mean, the point about remix culture is absolutely right. It's not just happening with religious cultures, it's happening with all other kinds of things. Um, there's this sense in which people tend to think of online as a place, right? And I think that that's probably, for some people it is. Like for some people, they only encounter other people who are like-minded online, and there are online communities that only take place online. But for other people, for most people, I would say, when it comes to religious belief or religious practice or anything else, there's usually it's more like a modality. There's an online element to things that also have an offline face-to-face element in your life. And I think that and my view is that our research on this is really at such a nascent stage that we are not. People are very good at studying like social media or online sites. I don't think we have a good grasp of how any of these like online activity as a modality of activity, as a modality of practice, how that's shaping other aspects of people's lives. I don't think we have really good research on that. There is some anthropologists have done some interesting things with how like-minded people are finding each other online, and that's usually oriented more toward how things that might otherwise be a very small subculture or people who might otherwise be isolated can in fact like find an online community. There's been some studies of political activity I just happen to know this because I know somebody working in this area, an anthropologist who studied kind of religious beliefs and online organizing of resistance activities and resistance groups in both Portland and Minnesota this year when there was the ice surge and all of that. So I mean, I think we're beginning to do all of that. But I think it's a great question, but I don't know that I don't know of any research, but I mean, this is not my direct area. I don't know of any research that really adequately addresses all of this. I would say that my seat of the pants, and that's very much what it is, so it's worth what it is. My seat of the pants notion is that mostly online modalities don't change that much for people. That is to say, it helps people express something that's already there. I don't know that like online communities are going to create some new impetus suddenly to be more religious. But they might contribute to the increasing pluralization of, kind of people who kind of engage in a more pluralistic array of religious beliefs or practices, or who want to embrace a more hybrid form of identity. I think, online modalities can facilitate all of that. So I think it can contribute to a kind of what some people might call a fracturing, what I would call a pluralization of these religious understandings. I don't know that it's going to, whether that's linked to any kind of revival. I don't think there's a revival in general, so maybe I'm not the right person to ask.
Thanks.
I don't really have a good answer, which is why I didn't answer.
Did anyone else from the panel want to respond to that? Yeah, Kati?
I could perhaps just say that among our interviewees, we have had several interviewees who have simply found their faith through internet. They have never had any physical congregation or any physical community. Their only community is online. And we have had interviewees who say that I would have left Christianity if I had not found a community online. And we have interviewees who say that I was non-religious before and I found faith through social media or through internet. So the role of social media and internet do play a role here independently, also independently from physical communities. And also, I could also perhaps say something of the role of the social media algorithms. If a young person once opens and shows interest towards Christianity on social media and reads this text a little bit longer, he can be sure, or she can be sure, that she gets repeatedly these messages on social media that and new input for her possible interest in Christianity. So that also plays a role, that actually social media and i.e. algorithms, they actually put new input to you if you at least show small interest towards Christianity.
Right, but presumably the opposite happens as well. I mean, there are other similar stories one could tell of people in high commitment religious groups who via social media or other online channels have found critical material regarding their faith and end up leaving it. I mean, I think the question is whether forces like social media or intensively online engagement have a positive or negative effect on religiosity. And I'm not sure that we have an answer to that.
Let's go back to the University of Victoria. I think you mentioned someone there had another question too.
Yes, thank you. I'm Brian Pollock. I'm at the center. And it's really a follow-up on the last talking about the really change of online behavior in all its complexity, including, I would add, things like streaming traditional religious movies. So how do we measure that? I mean, when you take a look at the fact that certainly here, most churches, you could attend online. It'll be posted on YouTube. How do we measure that? And how do we look at the impact of that, of having a virtual community only without people engaging? Because we know they engage in other kinds of online communities that remain online. So I'd just be interested to know is how much do we actually know about the impact of online behavior across the spectrum?
Sarah and then Conrad.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, surveys now are trying to capture that. There's different types of data, right? You can interview people, you can look at metrics of online usage, like how many views your stream, your religious service that was streamed got. But we're also trying to integrate into survey research now over the last few years. So starting to ask questions about it, like in the survey I ran in 2019 on millennials about their usage of kind of religion and spirituality online in various forms. The questions we ask about religious activities are often a bit more open now, so don't necessarily specify in person. That can include online activities. What I found with millennials is that it's especially those who do stuff in person who also do it online, right? So if you're interested in religion, spirituality, it's probably going to be reflected in your in-person activities. You're going to be part of a faith group often, or have some other form of religious or spiritual practice. And you're also going to be interested about it online. So you're going to do some online stuff with it. So that's kind of my short answer. There's also another side to this. The other side of the coin is I'm coming back to Galen Watts and Sam Reimer's article on the pollution of the concept of religion. There's also stuff online that has a quite negative tone when it comes to religion. So I'm thinking, for example, on Netflix, there's a lot of cult true crime documentaries that give off a very quite negative view of religion in general, that I'm actually noticing the impact of amongst students who are consuming that kind of media. So it can go both ways as well. And so that's also important to capture in some ways. Conrad?
Well, my quick answer to this question is that at Pew Research Center, we're just asking new questions in our surveys to measure online activity. When churches and synagogues and mosques closed during the pandemic, we started asking an attendance question that added intentional measurement of either attending or watching services online. But something else that this question brought to my mind is that a lot of the discussion about revival has been about indicators other than worship attendance and our traditional survey measures. So we've seen people say, well, more Bibles are being sold, or there are sports figures that are talking about their faith, or there's a big boom in the sales of Christian music, or other kinds of indicators. More people are using this app to read the Bible than used this app last year. And a challenge with all of these indicators is it's not clear at all what they mean. It could be that more people are buying Bibles because there's a curiosity to read the Bible that's greater than it has been. It could also be that people are just buying a new edition of the Bible. There's this nice leather-bound Bible that the President of the United States has endorsed, or that has a certain niche audience target that they're part of. And so I just wanted to mention that, and I'm curious whether anybody on the panel or in the audience finds this kind of evidence persuasive, that even though our traditional surveys aren't finding evidence of increased religiosity, do any of you think that these other type of indicators reveal something compelling?
Yeah, Joel?
Yeah, well, in short, I don't find these compelling, Conrad, and with you, probably unsurprisingly, as we look at lots of other things. I would say even on the like streaming religious services online, and seen several surveys that are trying to capture that during and sort of post-COVID lockdown stuff. Again, there, I think a lot of religious leaders kind of naively said, well, now that we're broadcasting online, all these people who have no religious background are going to suddenly start watching and plugging into religious communities. But I've seen very little evidence from a number of surveys from different national contexts to suggest that people are suddenly plugging into religious communities simply by virtue of the live streaming. Now, it does happen for some people, and I think this is always the qualifier for this larger discussion. By refuting the revival claims doesn't mean it doesn't happen for some people in some contexts and spaces, but that's a very different kind of interpretation than revival. And I think this conversation about religion online is really an extension of things we've seen over the last probably 50, 75 years of like those who are attending religious services were the most likely to listen to religious programming on radio or television and so forth. This is kind of the latest medium where we're seeing these kinds of things that for the most part, it's people who are actively involved in religious communities who are tapping into all of these other kinds of mediums for religious expression in life.
Great. Thanks, Joel. I want to do some questions in the chat because I see there's questions coming up there. Penny's got a question too, but let me read this question from Scott Jolie in the chat. So if panelists want to scroll up, I mean, there have been a lot of new messages coming in, but I don't want to try and get as many questions in the chat as we can. So Scott says, thinking of the social media piece, that people might be exposed to crisis more often, and that the nature of those crises at least seem to be more global, climate change, the pandemic, end stage capitalism. Do you think there's a change in people's sense of ultimate concern that's not being captured by studies around religiosity being undertaken today? I don't know if anyone from the panel wants to tackle that one. Kati?
Well, one aspect that I would like to add to this topic is actually that what we see in our studies in Finland is the pessimism towards future among young people and the increase in pessimism. And young people are not so optimistic of neither their own future nor the future of the world. And the figures are actually very strong. How much the pessimism has increased. So this sort of links to the question that Scott here brings up. So somehow young people are more exposed to these crises, and they see that my own future and the future of the world is not as optimistic as it used to be. And that may also have a linkage to this, what we see in the interest to possible interest towards religion.
Hmm.
Yeah, David?
I have to say I'm skeptical here. I mean, it's not that I disagree that there might be this kind of vibe shift in terms of people's optimism or pessimism or concern about crises. It's just an awful lot of commentary. And I think this comes back to the question of why this narrative really attained such traction. Amounts to explanations in search of a phenomenon to explain. So there are all kinds of things happening in the world that are truly fascinating and horrifying, and it is kind of made for op-ed writers to say, oh, there's supposedly been a religious revival. How can we explain that? And then this is an opportunity to write 1,000 words about the climate crisis or uh, Ukraine or Gaza or you name it, economic precarity. There are any number of fascinating big problems in the world today. I just sort of suspect that it's just a little bit too convenient, and the actual link between these things has yet to be shown. I mean, the phenomenon itself of religious revival remains to be shown, never mind the link between that and these crises. So that's my skeptical view.
And
Oh,
Nathan, I just wanted to
yeah,
push
Laura, yeah.
David just because of an earlier point he made. David, are you aware of research on optimism amongst youth at other times when there might have appeared to be this kind of coalescing of crises? So in other words, going back to the way Sarah thinks about this sometimes is this a more longitudinal approach. Are there other periods of time where we can say, well, youth are not optimistic about the future at all?
There may well be that kind of data. I'm not familiar with it, so I'm not qualified to say, but it would be a fascinating thing to investigate.
Right. I want to do one more question from the chat. Then I'll go to Penny and then Ing. So there's a question in the chat, again, scrolling way up, from Karen Gottfried. How do trends in religious belief differ from trends in religious identification, if at all, if data are available? For example, like around ideas about like this category of spiritual but not religious. I don't know if anyone, maybe Sarah, I don't know if you'd want to talk about this issue about like religious belief versus religious identification. Yeah,
You
Sarah.
want me to go?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and David's worked on that. A lot of people on this panel have worked a lot on this, so I'm sure you'll all jump in. But I mean, what's peculiar about the Canadian context, especially the Quebec context, is that you actually have a lot of people who identify with the religious tradition, but who actually don't have strong religious beliefs, who don't necessarily believe in God. It's not everyone, but there's an important chunk there of that group who sees it more as a cultural identification marker rather than a more kind of belief marker. There's some alignment. You do have a portion of the population who believes, who identifies with a religion, who's practicing, but there is also a lot of disalignment amongst those indicators. You have a spiritual but not religious group. It's not a majority usually of a population, and then you can debate about how we measure the SBNR crowd, the spiritual but not religious. But typically, in ways we have tried to measure them, we're usually about a quarter to a third of the population, at least here in Canada, that I've found. And and typically the group that identifies with a religious tradition has been bigger when Christianity was more kind of a cultural norm, if you will. If it was more normal to be Christian, you'd have more people identifying Christian than, say, held certain Christian beliefs, core Christian beliefs, like in heaven and hell, for example. Now that identifying with Christianity is less normal, there's more people who say they have no religion. That might be shifting, right? Maybe we're in a transition where we might see a few more people who have beliefs than who actually identify with religion. But I don't believe there's a huge quiet majority who have religious beliefs but are just not showing up in survey. It's not you typically when you interview people or when we do more in-depth survey research, what we're finding is there is a portion of SBNR. They're important, they're really fascinating to study, but they're also not like a huge part of the population.
Conrad, I don't know if you'd want to jump in on this question.
Well, I had two thoughts. One, in terms of belief in God in the United States, Gallup has the longest running time series on this, and what they find is that there's been a steady decline over time. A smaller and smaller share of Americans say they believe in God. The second thought is that this reminds me of Grace Davies' thesis that in the UK in particular, perhaps at one time there was a lot of people who believed they just didn't belong to the Church of England. I find that the work that David and Steve Bruce have done evaluating the survey data on that phenomenon uh, was persuasive, and that was not what has happened in the UK. So I think in general, the pattern is no doubt that both belief and identity are trending down, although there may be some interesting exceptions in certain places. It's interesting that these confirmands in Finland are believing more than confirmands used to. I know David has raised questions about, well, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be confirmed if you don't believe in God or believe the things that presumably being confirmed one would think has meant, but maybe it has been more of a social ritual. Kati mentioned that it's something that basically 70% of kids do. Now it seems to have more of the religious element that might have always been assumed.
All right, thank you. Okay, let me go to Penny next, and then Inga.
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, my question was, I took my hand down. My question is on a kind of different topic. I always think it's really interesting that these stories in the press are generally about, individual religion, the individual, right? Individual, are they believing? Are they going to church? What are these individuals doing? What are they thinking? And that makes a lot of sense. But, when I think of revival, I think about things like there was a news story about something that looked like a revival at Asbury Seminary / college in Kentucky a few years ago. And my niece got her master's degree there, so I kind of followed that news. And it was this thing that happened in the university chapel, and it started out as one of their regular, I don't know, Thursday night prayer meetings, whatever it is they do. It's a Bible college, they do stuff. But it just kind of grew and grew, and people kept coming, and then other people decided to bring those people food and coffee, and they just kept doing this kind of prayer meeting / revivalistic worship kind of thing, and it lasted for, I don't know, a weekend. It ended up having a few hundreds of people, which for a very small place is a significant thing. So when I think of revival, I think of that kind of thing happening in lots of different locations, right? It's like something more like the American periods of awakening, right? And I guess, and that story did get, I thought, pretty decent coverage of that as an event, with again all these big questions like, is this happening more generally? And of course, but they did actually seek out academics, and all the academics said no, it's not. So it wasn't too overblown. So I guess my question for all of you who have been kind of studying this with more, I've just been kind of following this as I follow everything else because I need to keep up on this stuff given what I do. But for people who have data, is there any evidence for things like that happening? I'm anything more kind of communal / ritual / communal or ritual. To me, when I think of revival, I think I'm very Durkheimian in that sense. I think about what Durkheim said that gatherings like that do, right? That they give a kind of energy to people that can kind of drive and motivate further kinds of behaviors. So I'm just wondering if there's any evidence of that. I have not. I've done a little bit of checking around. I can't find any evidence of that, but that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Maybe I can address that. Penny, I absolutely agree. I think that the term revival to most of us would suggest something like the Great Awakening and, big tents, prayer meetings, and the Asbury phenomenon. That was a real thing that happened. It was really fascinating. And if you had dozens of those, then I would be persuaded that there really was some kind of revival going on. To be a sort of fair-minded academic, I think it is unfortunate in a sense that this whole conversation has become so non-academic and so polemical that, everybody, including me, is sort of taking an entrenched position. Yes, this is happening, or no, this is not happening. Actually, as I said right at the outset, I think there are some interesting things happening that are worth investigating. So, for example, it does appear that more adults are going for baptism in the Catholic Church and in some other churches, including the Church of England. Now, the numbers in the scheme of things are pretty small. We're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands of people. But still, it's a phenomenon. I think it's well worth studying. And indeed, I've signed up to talk about it at the next meeting of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. So you can get whatever I learn about it in October there. At the same time, and again, I think this has kind of fed into the story, we've seen what appears to be a plateau in the proportion of people in at least the United States and maybe some other Western countries saying that they have no religion. Now, religious change is extremely gradual and it works over a very long term, and we still see the generational contrasts that are the driver of secularization. So I don't think that we've seen secularization come to an end or anything bottoming out. This is a very short period that more or less coincides with a pandemic, so that itself generates all kinds of measurement problems about comparing one year with another, and then different survey modes because survey taking has been affected by the pandemic. Anyway, all that said, I think there is something genuinely interesting and worth investigating about this apparent short-term plateau in the proportion of people who claim to be nuns. So these are issues that I don't think really relates to revival per se, but nevertheless, they're things that we ought to be looking into.
Well, and I think that's really interesting. And I'll then mute my mic, but I want to say, I just want to give a shout out also to Sarah's work, because as she has pointed out, and maybe some others in this group have as well, it's not an either or, right? It's not that either there's secularization or there are some people who are becoming more religious, right? What secularization does is it kind of loosens up older, taken for granted ways of doing things and older norms, and it undermines older sources of authority. And so there can be both of those things going on over time, a long-term decline in religious participation or religious belief, and also pockets where we have these interesting kind of surges of belief activity, new creative options. And again, I do think that online modalities can facilitate that where it wouldn't have been facilitated before. I just think this whole set of things is fascinating. And like many of you, I'm frustrated sometimes by the media coverage because they coin a word and then that word becomes what they like revival, whether it's kind of a helpful word or not. And then that becomes what organizes the discussion. And I think a lot of really important things are being left out.
Yeah, thanks. Joel, do you want to add something quickly?
Yeah, one of the things I've long appreciated about Dobbelari's approach to looking at secularization is sort of that multi-dimensional approach where you capture a bit of a micro, meso, and macro. And Penny, your sort of reflections here, I think, alert me and perhaps us to however we think about revival and how we might define that there are these multiple levels that we ought to probably pay attention to those different areas and ways that it may or may not be present. Maybe it's some, like an Asbury revival kind of thing might be present that might not be present at the individual level and vice versa.
All right, thanks, Joel. Okay, the very last question goes to Inga. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name.
No, that's perfectly fine. And thank you for having me and letting me ask a question as well, because I very much enjoyed the panel and all the things that have been said. I fully actually agree with a lot of you. I'm Inge. I work at Tilburg University. I work with the European Value Study. David knows also this study, and we're in the field right now. So that will be excellent opportunity to gather more data, I guess, and to find out what is really happening. I was picking up on things that have been said, for example, about the trends that we see or that are being covered in the media, that they are all averages, right? And David pointed out this idea of dispersion. You could also think polarization, maybe more into the extremes, but that also means if you look at it in this way, what about if people are going to the extremes, how homogeneous are these then, these groups? And I think that's a point that we didn't touch upon yet, and that I'm now a bit afraid to use the term revival, because actually, what does it mean? But what about if this revival is also going back to the more traditional forms of religion? So we talked about people becoming more religious, but what kind of religion is this? And I think this is also part of the narrative that we hear in the media quite often, that this going back to religion is also going back to a more traditional form of religion. And I was wondering what the panel thinks about this narrative, because this is what has been told, for example, in the Catholic Church. It's not like masses in the language of the country, but it's a Latin mass that the young people prefer. So it's a more traditional form. So I was wondering what the panel members think about that narrative.
Yeah, Conrad, do you want to take this one?
My impression is that there are certainly lots of reports about people in the US, for example, returning to Christian Orthodox churches, Russian Orthodox Church in particular, and no doubt there are definitely some individual congregations that are growing a lot, attracting a lot of new people. I haven't yet seen evidence at the national level that traditional Catholic churches or Christian Orthodox churches are experiencing a big nationwide surge. So it seems early to say. We don't see that yet in our Pew Research Center survey data. It might be different in other countries.
Kati.
Well, if I think of the data that we have from Finland, we do see increased interest in various traditional groups, but at the same time we also see, if I think of the data that we have collected among the Lutheran confirmants, those are very mainline liberal groups, basically. So. But that message that we hear from the field, that is more strong from the traditional groups, that they attract young people more than from liberal groups. But from both groups we do hear that.
Anyone else on the panel want to add something? Yeah, David.
Just that, Inga, I agree with you. And as I said early on, I think we have a tendency to look at the central tendency or mean or median and not enough at the variation around that. And, one of the consequences of individualization is that there is more variation. And some of that is a movement towards what would have been seen as the ends of the spectrum. So yeah, that's one of the things that we can study and should study.
All right, thanks, David. I think that'll be the last question. I just want to give a chance to the panelists, maybe just for a very brief, if you want to add a brief closing remark. Maybe Sarah, I don't know if you want to sort of put you on the spot, but Sarah, I don't know if you want to add your any closing thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, my view is no religious revival yet, from what I can see in the data. But to keep our eyes peeled for it too, right? I don't want to be the person who wears blinders, who won't be able to see it if something actually happens, kind of like what Penny was referring to. Maybe it's happening in different ways that we need to capture better. And I'm not someone who thinks that just because decline has been happening for some time, it's always going to happen forever. At some point, the religiosity levels in a population are going to get so low, and we're approaching that in Canada, that there's going to be more variation because it's such a rare phenomenon that it's hard to capture with data in a kind of steady way, if you want to put it in a quick explanation. And so it's interesting to see where we'll go from here. And I mean, but also, any big claim, take it with a grain of salt and think critically about it. I think this was a good example of it that we saw in the media recently.
Conrad.
When we see a big upsurge in religion, we will be excited to report on it at Pew Research Center. We haven't seen it yet,
calls. We'll be on it, right?
If it comes, we'll tell that story.
Kati.
Well, it was very nice to have this discussion with you. I really enjoyed this. So thank you, everybody. both for the panelists and those here present.
David.
Yes, it's been nice to have basically an academic conversation about this. I must say that I'm looking forward to having more academic conversations and fewer general media arguments about this phenomenon. But I'm probably being optimistic. Anyway, thank you very much for the invitation to be here.
Great. And Joel, I'll give you the last word.
Sure. I mean, Sarah and I probably view these things very similarly as we've written about in our stuff on religious nuns. But I would probably hate for everyone to leave thinking bad thoughts about the media in general or about religious leaders as if none of them actually have scientific literacy. And while that might be the case, I think we probably all, even as social scientists, need to be cautious that there is good journalism out there and folks who do pay good attention to these things. And so I think as much as we might criticize the other side of the fence, to also be attentive to there's heterogeneity among the different groups that we're interacting with, even on those who study religion. So I'll conclude with that. And thanks to everyone for a good discussion.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks to all our panelists. It was a
Thanks,
really
everyone.
great discussion. And for people who asked questions and who were carrying on discussion in the chat too, I just dropped a couple links in the chat for the Center for Studies in Religion and Society at UVic for the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. Also, since we have so many people here, I wanted to just include 2 links to new books from the NCF that are open access. So anyone can read these. You don't need a subscription or anything like that, about religion and non-religion in the same-sex marriage debates, and also about community gardens and non-religion. So check out those 2 books. And there's a link to sign up for the NCF mailing list as well, if you're not already subscribed. So thanks again, everyone, and hope to see you all at a future event.